John Gotti. John Gotti died in prison in the year 2002 after serving about 10 years of a life sentence for, among other things, his convictions for 5 different murders. John Gotti was the boss of the Gambino crime family in the mafia. But before he died, while he was still in federal prison, one of the things that John Gotti got to enjoy as a feature of life in federal prison was that he had fairly regular visits with members of his family. And because those conversations were monitored by prison authorities, in his case, they were not just audio taped, they were videotaped. We can now, for the ages, see in living color, or at least in blurry, washed out, used to be color, not just the movie idea or the comic book idea of what gangsters are like. With the Gotti prison tapes, you can see the real deal. And he's exactly as charming as you might expect, not just in dealing with his peers in crime, but in dealing with his immediate family members, too. For example, this is how he spoke to his 10-year-old grandson, who had come to visit him. During that visit, the grandson told him that his career plans were to become a professional athlete. This is how his grandfather responded.
There's a good chance that you might go to school and become a lawyer, John. I hope so.
No, Daddy, he is going to become a lawyer.
No, I'm not.
Really?
No, I'm not. I'm going to be a basketball player.
You ain't gonna be a basketball player.
Don't get smart out there, because I'm no move for it.
Baseball player.
You ain't gonna be a baseball player or a basketball player.
Of course I am.
Let me tell you something.
He's being smart today. There's something in him today.
Let me tell you something about that.
Tell me what I wanted to do.
Let me tell you something.
I never said I wanted to do it.
Let me tell you something about basketball players and baseball players. To be a good basketball player or a baseball player, first of all, you got to be a good liar, a good low life, and an imbecile.
Take a lot of drugs.
You got to take steroids. You must take steroids. And anybody that takes steroids is a garbage pail. You know what?
Why then? I'll be a cook.
I don't care if you don't be nothing. You think you're being selfish with me or spiteful with me? You get an chicken from me. I ain't your father or my children. For me,
He's being smart out.
No, for me, you get an chicken.
Believe me, he'll
You get a chicken you never want to. You'll never forget the chicken you get from me. You understand? I got too many friends right now. I don't need you for a friend. I got 1 million friends right now. I got 1 million people who, if they could come here to see me now, they would cry just to be able to be here to see me. So you ain't doing me no favor coming to see me or talking sass to me. You saved that for your father. You saved that sass for me. I put my foot up your ass. You hear me? Don't you look at me. I'm serious than cancer, boy. The truth of the matter is with you guys, you're spoiled goddamn rotten. There's people that even have a goddamn good mail wouldn't get the answers you gave just me. You can look as sad as you want to look. Now get that phone to your uncle and get the hell out of here. You left hand with me. Comes from your mother, not from me.
That was John Gotti in prison in 1998, swearing at his grandson and sending his grandson away for having temerity to say he wanted to be an athlete. The grandson who had dressed up in a suit and tie to come to see him, along with his mother and his uncle. In those same visits, which we have tapes of and transcripts of, we also know that John Gotti shared a vote of confidence in his daughter's husband. His own son-in-law, a guy named Carmine Agnello. Carmine Agnello himself was reportedly not able to visit John Gotti in person because of his own troubles with the criminal law. But that did not stop Gotti from telling his daughter what he thought about her husband on these same prison tapes. And I will spare you more of the tapes, in part because the bleeping gets exhausting. But on these same tapes, Gotti told his daughter about her husband, quote, "He's going to get indicted any day, this moron. Look, you want a prediction? By June, your husband's going to get indicted. And every 2-3 cents he's got, going to be all tied up." Gotti told his daughter about her husband, quote, "He's an imbecile." Then Gotti pretended to read a list of imaginary charges against his daughter's husband. Quote, "You got to see the charges. Malicious mopery, possession of brain with intent to use, stolen bumper, hubcap. That was a reference to the fact that his daughter's husband was in the auto salvage and scrap metal business. So that was John Gotti saying, in essence, he'd get in trouble someday for a stolen bumper or a stolen hubcap. Gotti also referenced the fact that his son-in-law was thought to have some sort of mood disorder that resulted in violent rages and for which he took medications. Gotti said to his daughter in that prison visit in 1998 about her husband, he said, quote, "Is he feeling good? Is he not feeling good? Is his medication increase, decrease? Is it up, down? Does he get into the back seat of the car and think somebody has stolen the steering wheel?" Nice. Nice guy. Must be nice for the whole family. That was 1998, John Gotti, before he died a few years later in prison, berating his daughter about her then husband, his own son-in-law. But you know, in some ways, John Gotti was a little bit right, at least on one of those points, because those prison tapes were from 1998. The following year, 1999, a new business opened up in Queens, New York, a new business called Stadium Scrap. It was called Stadium Scrap because it was right up near Shea Stadium where the New York Mets used to play. And Stadium Scrap opened its doors in 1999, and they started buying up dead cars and putting them in the crusher, smashing them into hunks of metal, and then selling that metal to shredders and scrap dealers. And when Stadium Scrap opened up in 1999, it seemed like every other business of that kind in that part of Queens, New York. But if you looked super, super closely at Stadium Scrap, there was something about that business that was very different compared to other businesses of that type. Stadium Scrap, it turns out, had cameras everywhere and microphones. Quote, "A pan and tilt microwave camera was positioned on a pole approximately 100 yards from the entrance to the business. It viewed the front of the yard and most of the street. Additionally, a recording device was installed on the yard telephone, and a listening device was installed in the trailer that was used as an office there. They installed 2 video cameras inside the trailer and 1 outside the trailer overlooking the salvage yard. And these were not just the kinds of cameras that regular businesses set up for security purposes. These were cameras and microphones that were hidden. And they were monitored for surveillance purposes because Stadium Scrap, that business that opened up in Queens in 1999, Stadium Scrap, was fake. It was a big, long-running, undercover law enforcement operation. Multiple law enforcement authorities got together and they hatched this plan that they would open up a fake business in Queens, a fake scrap metal and auto salvage business in that part of Queens. And they would do that basically as a sting operation because that business sector in that part of New York was generally believed by law enforcement to be all mobbed up. And so they thought they could use a fake business of that kind to try to crack open the organized crime infiltration of those businesses. So undercover law enforcement officers learned to drive wreckers and car crushers and forklifts and flatbed trucks and all the other stuff. They learned how to do this type of business. They opened up this fake business in early 1999, and they started doing the work. They were buying and selling scrapped autos and scrap metal. They were doing auto salvage. But bingo, as soon as they opened that thing up, instant results. Within a month of them opening up this fake business, Stadium Scrap, within a month of them opening it, in walked, as predicted by John Gotti, in walked John Gotti's son-in-law, Carmine Agnello, the guy who Gotti said was destined to be indicted any day now. According to state and federal prosecutors, this is what happened next. This is from the New York Daily News coverage at the time. Quote, "Mr. Agnello and Joe Berger, a 390-pound childhood pal known as Jumbo, visited Stadium Scrap and told the undercover cops working there that Agnello wanted them to bring their metal to his business instead." This is from the New York Times coverage at the same time. Quote, "Law enforcement authorities said Agnello gave the officers a simple message: sell him the crushed cars at artificially low prices or suffer the consequences." Law enforcement officials said that when the undercover officers refused, Mr. Agnello had his associates firebomb the business, Stadium Scrap. And of course, because Stadium Scrap was fake, because it was an undercover law enforcement operation set up specifically to catch criminals. There were cameras and microphones everywhere that caught all of that. So they were able to lay it all out in the indictment, and in the press releases they were very proudly able to soon put out about the indictments that derived from that case. Quote, on the night of June 10th, at the direction of Agnello, the lock on Stadium Scrap's gate was cut. On June 15th, Agnello directed the firebombing of Stadium Scrap's office trailer and a flatbed truck. At 2 a.m. on June 17th, at Agnello's express direction, Stadium Scrap's gate lock was cut, its yard was entered, glass bottles filled with gasoline were thrown, and a flatbed truck and the gasoline was ignited with road flares. On June 29th, at 1 a.m., at Agnello's express direction, Stadium's gate lock was again cut. Gasoline was thrown on the steps of the trailer office and on the trailer itself, and the gasoline was ignited. On June 30th, Agnello had Berger, remember Jumbo's last name is Berger, so technically he's Jumbo Berger. Agnello had Jumbo, Mr. Berger, inspect the damage caused by the fire the night before, which Mr. Berger shortly thereafter was observed doing. So this bust, this long-time undercover sting operation involving the cops running a fake scrap metal and auto salvage business in Queens, they got a bunch of press for it at the time. I think in part because of the cinematic nature of this law enforcement operation, honestly, but also because it did not take them long to catch a big fish. I mean, they got Gotti's son-in-law, who it turns out is not a guy who was just looked upon with disfavor by his famous father-in-law in prison. According to the Daily News at the time, Agnello was viewed as a, quote, real-life Tony Soprano, a ruthless 250-pound mobster who also controlled highly profitable, legitimate businesses. Over the years, Agnello has scuffled with cops writing him traffic tickets. He was accused of beating an ex-employee with a telephone. Prosecutors say he threatened to break the fingers of a debt collector and put him in the trunk of a car. The indictment says Agnello threatened to hit a stockbroker with a hammer. But when they snapped the trap shut on this sting operation, this Agnello guy, for all his charms, he was not the only guy they caught. In the initial indictment, Agnello and 3 other guys were charged under the state's Organized Crime Control Act. But by the time they wrapped up the operation the following year, it wasn't just him and a handful of guys who were in his crew. By the time they wrapped this up the following year, there were 49 people who got arrested in this sting. So yeah, this got a bunch of press coverage. There were definitely bragging rights involved for the prosecutors here when these indictments came down. But looking back on it now, what seems particularly interesting for us now is that it wasn't only the prosecutors who had bragging rights about that sting. Now, as I mentioned, this was a joint law enforcement operation, and it involved a whole bunch of different law enforcement entities, including NYPD and prosecutors in Queens. It also involved another agency whose annual report that year actually contained some of the juiciest details we got about this whole operation. And that entity, which was a key part of this sting operation, was the fraud squad at the New York State Insurance Department. And the New York State Insurance Department doesn't have that name anymore. That insurance department has now been incorporated into an agency called the New York Department of Financial Services. But it still does the same work, and they've still got the same law enforcement responsibilities. And I'm sure, because they do criminal insurance enforcement, I am sure a bunch of that is as boring as it sounds. But sometimes, in the relatively recent history of that agency, it has been the opposite of boring. It's been front page news for many days running. It's been dudes learning to run auto crushers, opening up fake scrap metal businesses in Queens next to Shea Stadium, and then getting firebombed by dudes named Jumbo who threatened to snap off people's fingers and shove them into trunks. I mean, it has involved operations that wrapped up 50 suspected gangsters at a time, including proving John Gotti right about the propensity of his son-in-law and crime family associate for getting indicted sometime soon, in part because of his volcanic and uncontrollably violent temper. And that is the same agency, the exact same agency, that has now subpoenaed the insurance broker that has done business for years with the President of the United States and his business. That is the agency that has sent that company what is reported to be an expansive 9-page subpoena demanding that that insurance broker hand over more than 10 years of internal company documents that mention Donald Trump or the Trump Organization, plus all policies that were issued to the president or to his business, plus any applications or supporting materials that were submitted by the president or his business in order to obtain those insurance policies. And no, that is not opening up a mob honeypot scrapyard up by the Mets old stadium. But the ball on this one is now rolling with that same agency.
To your knowledge, did the president ever provide inflated assets to an insurance company?
Yes.
Can you explain why you had these financial statements and what you used them for?
When we were dealing later on with insurance companies, we would provide them with these copies so that they would understand that the premium, which is based sometimes upon the individual's capabilities to pay, would be reduced.
And all of this was done at the president's direction and with his knowledge?
Yes.
And did this information provided to us inflate the president's assets?
I believe these numbers are inflated.
To your knowledge, did the president ever provide inflated assets to a bank in order to help him obtain a loan?
But you may answer that question.
These documents and others were provided to Deutsche Bank on one occasion where I was with them in our attempt to obtain money so that we can put a bid on the Buffalo Bills.
Thank you for your answers.
Today, for the fourth time in 9 days, the president's longtime attorney, Michael Cohen, gave testimony to Congress. For the second time today, he testified behind closed doors to the Intelligence Committee in the House. That committee had initially only intended to speak with him once Thursday of last week, but Cohen's lawyers and members of that committee say a decision was made to bring him back for a second round of testimony today, only because Cohen brought that committee substantial new information last week. Committee members decided they wanted to ask him more about that new information, and crucially, they wanted to ask him to provide any supporting documentation he could show them that might be able to back up these claims. And again, we don't know what has happened behind closed doors. But even just the stuff, the physical stuff that Cohen provided during his public testimony looks like it may be real trouble. I mean, those financial statements you just heard Cohen being questioned about, those financial statements were 3 years worth of statements of financial condition that Cohen says were submitted by the president and his business to at least one bank to try to obtain a bank loan, and to insurance companies. And what Cohen described about the content of those financial statements and what they were used for looks very much like a reasonably substantiated allegation of felony bank fraud and felony insurance fraud. I mean, Cohen stated that the assets on those financial statements appeared to him to be inflated. That is not a wild claim. One Trump property that's listed on those statements, property in Westchester County, was bought by Trump for under $8 million. Since 2012, it has twice been assessed as being worth less than $20 million. Forbes just yesterday reported that the net worth of that property right now is about $24 million. The president himself, in his federal ethics declaration last year, declared that he believed that property to be worth somewhere between $25 and $50 million. Nevertheless, despite those assessed values in the president's own declaration of the worth of that property this past year, on those financial statements, he listed the worth of that property as $291 million. And again, he reportedly used these statements with banks and insurance companies. And $291 million is not a rounding error for a property like this. In addition to that, the Washington Post further reports that upon reviewing these financial statements, it appears that Trump not only inflated the value of some of his assets, he also, quote, exaggerated his wealth by leaving things out. In 2011 and 2012, for instance, the statements of financial condition omitted his hotel in Chicago, which at the time was carrying a high debt load. The likely result, Trump's overall debt seemed smaller. And, you know, this isn't a moral story, right? I mean, it says something about your character, but that's beside the point, right? I mean, it's one thing to, you know, tell somebody you met at a bar that you're worth a lot more than you are. It's like, you know, it's like lying about your height or lying about being first in your class at Wharton. or lying about how much money you inherited from your dad and whether or not you're self-made, lying about whether or not you won the popular vote, lying about your inaugural crowd, lying about whether or not you ever actually built 1 inch of the wall. I mean, lying is lying is lying. Lying can be a whole way of life, it turns out. But it's different when you lie in your written financial statements that you have submitted to financial institutions in an effort to try to get bank loans or to defraud insurance companies. When you lie in financial statements like that, those industries are tightly regulated, at least against that kind of fraud. And when you lie to those kinds of financial institutions for those kinds of purposes, and there's documentation of it, you're telling the kinds of lies that get chased down and prosecuted by, among others, the types of people who are willing to open up a fake scrapyard in Queens and then film themselves getting firebombed multiple times in order to lock up 50 mobsters at a go. And to the extent that Michael Cohen's testimony and supporting documentation bolsters claims of felony bank fraud, it's important to know that the entity Cohen described as the target of that attempted bank fraud, Deutsche Bank, they are now reportedly cooperating with congressional investigators. When it comes to the insurance side of that alleged fraud by Cohen, it's important to note that upon receiving that expansive subpoena from the agency that invented stadium scrap and faced off with Jumbo, that large insurance agency is also reportedly fully cooperating with law enforcement and investigating authorities. So those balls are rolling. And speaking of rolling, today Michael Cohen was back before the Intelligence Committee again. And this time, in what must have been an ominous sign for the White House, Michael Cohen and his legal team walked into that testimony rolling a bunch of suitcases. 1 suitcase, 2 suitcases, 3 suitcases, plus all the file folders and the briefcases, all full of documents. Among the materials that Michael Cohen is said to have handed over to the Intelligence Committee today were additional documents about the preparation of his previous testimony to Congress, for which he has now pled guilty to lying about certain aspects of the Trump Organization's secret efforts during the campaign to build a big, rich Moscow real estate project with help from the Russian government and at least 1 sanctioned Russian bank. Think about those lies. Why did Cohen lie that way to Congress the first time he testified before them? There's no reason that those lies about the Trump Tower Moscow project would have benefited Michael Cohen in any way himself. The lies that he told in that testimony, which again, he's pled guilty for, those lies appear to have been designed not to help himself at all, but instead to offer political cover to President Trump. According to reports from Emily Jane Fox at Vanity Fair and CNN and others, today's new documents from Cohen about that testimony were intended to bolster the claims from Cohen that lawyers acting on behalf of President Trump helped concoct his false testimony about Trump Tower Moscow. Again, false testimony that did not benefit Cohen. It specifically benefited President Trump. And soliciting false testimony before Congress is usually described as obstruction of justice. It was described that way in the articles of impeachment, both against Richard Nixon and Bill Clinton. Just as a matter of criminal law, it's also just potentially suborning perjury, which is a felony in its own right. Although, of course, that would depend on the exact facts of the case. But today was the day when Michael Cohen initially was supposed to be reporting to federal prison to start serving his federal prison sentence for lying to Congress and campaign finance felonies and other crimes. After being given a few weeks extension by the federal judge overseeing his case, it is just remarkable to see him spending his last weeks of liberty rolling in suitcases full of documents that may ultimately stand to bury the president. Emily Jane Fox joins us next. Stay with us.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.